Kenneth Goldsmith, a poet who lives in New York City, a city full of words. Poetry is all around us. We just need to reframe it, and suddenly it becomes our own. Now I'm going to read you a very short poem, something brand new, entitled French Writer Wins Nobel. Stockholm. Patrick Modiano of France, who has made a lifelong study of the Nazi occupation and its effects on his country, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature Thursday. The Swedish Academy gave the $1.1 million prize to Modiano, 69, quote, for the art of memory with which he has evoked, with the most ungraspable human destinies, and uncovered the life world of the occupation. AP. I was trained as a sculptor, and at some point I began making sculptures of books, and I began putting these sort of rhyming words on these books, and I got so interested in the rhyme and the repetition and the words that I became less interested in the forms of the books. And over the course of many years, it took quite a long time, I ended up dropping the sculptural form. So I just kind of kept dropping armatures until I was working with pure language. My most well-known book is a book called Day, which is just a retyping of the New York Times, one day's edition. Every single word that was in there, I just retyped the whole thing. And there was my next year and a half of production taken care of. I mean, it's sort of that stupid and that simple. My ideas come because I respond to technology. I think where technology leads, art follows, not the other way around. And we're living in a time of such incredible technological changes that just listening to technology gives me amazing ideas. As though I'm not really an e-poet or a net artist, or don't even, I publish paper books. My whole ethos in production is predicated upon the fact that we live in the digital age. The ways in which I write are digital ways, even if they appear on an analog page. The president's car is now turning up onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the Trade Mart. I was on Stemmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the Trade Mart. It appears something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street there by the Stemmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by. Just a moment, please. The book 7 American Deaths and Disasters, of course, is a tribute to Andy Warhol's Death and Disaster pictures. In that book, I transcribed 7 tragedies that were happening as they were unfolding. I wanted to hear what are the words we use to describe something we never thought we'd have to describe in the moment. So radio and television is very canned most of the time. But here people were really improvising, flying by the seat of their pants, trying to find the words to describe what was happening before them. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please. Parkland Hospital, there has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. The president's car is now going past me. The limousine is now traveling at a very high rate of speed. Secret Service men standing up in the limousine. They are armed with some submachine guns. It appears as though someone in the limousine might have been hit by gunfire. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man spread-eagled over the top of the car. We understand Governor and Mrs. Connolly are in the car with President and Mrs. Kennedy. We can't see who has been hit, if anyone's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong. Andy Kaufman's ideas of taking things a little bit too far is something I find very inspiring. Something that be like, okay, can this end now? But it keeps going on, and it keeps going on. And it gets, it gets super uncomfortable. Comedy in a strange way is supposed to make you feel comfortable, reinforce things that are true through stereotypes. And then you have people that push it a little too far. I think Sacha Baron Cohen, in his many guises, pushes things a little bit too far, into almost a performance art. And so those are the kinds of comedy that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in pranks. The idea that you're trying to get something over on people. I mean, Duchamp's whole oeuvre was often called a prank. As a matter of fact, upon hearing of Duchamp's death, Picasso was heard to say one line: he was wrong. And Beckett, talking about Duchamp in 1984, said, a writer could never do this. Okay? So the idea that as late as 69, 67, 69, around the time Duchamp dies, even as late as 84, Duchamp is still being looked at by legends of the avant-garde as a bit of a hoax, as a bit of a prank. And of course I find that to be really attractive. People like Abbie Hoffman, public political stunts, I find to be very inspiring. What can you get away with? I'm in the motorcade now. It looks as though they're going to Parkland Hospital. They're on the road to Parkland at this time. The Secret Service men are still spread-eagled over whoever is in the car. The President and Mrs. Kennedy, as we understand, and Governor and Mrs. Connolly. At this point, it looks as though it could have been one or two, or even all of the people within the car may have been victims, may have been struck by shots. We don't know. If I don't have doubt, I don't do the project. I mean, if it looks like literature, I'm not interested in doing it. Why would I care? Certainly, I don't write for a market. There is no market for what I do. There's only ideas. And so, I'm obliged as a poet to be as experimental as possible because I have nothing to gain by playing it safe. I can understand it's a very different game if you're a novelist and you churn out things that people buy. It generates millions of dollars and great readership, and they're looking for the next one. But that's really not poetry's problem. Poetry's problem is really metaphysical and philosophical. Therefore, I think poetry is the most advanced and interesting place to be from an artistic standpoint, because it's the only one of the arts that really isn't predicated on any kind of economy at all, and therefore is the freest of all of the arts. Well, it's weird because I'm hearing this music and I'm seeing online this video of 3 Charlie's Angels running out of the door. Jeff McKinney's running in the room. Well, much talk today about Farrah Fawcett, certainly, but now there is news that Michael Jackson has been rushed to the hospital. I think it's in Los Angeles, I'm not sure. We're going to have a special report coming up. We have a squawk box too, an intercom that links us to the newsroom back in New York. Oftentimes, I'll read academic papers or reviews about my work, and I won't even recognize it as being my work. And in a sense, my work is so objectified and it's so far outside of myself that any criticism that you bring to it, any ideas that you bring to it are valid ideas. And I can be completely surprised by the way people are speaking about something I've written, because in a sense I haven't really written it. I've just sort of moved it, onto a pedestal for everybody to examine. So it's a much cleaner way of dealing with an artifact, saying, gee, isn't that interesting? Any angle you hit on that thing is going to be right. And I kind of feel that contemporary writing needs to be self-conscious of the media and manipulate it as its primary content. If you aren't making artworks with the intention of having them copied, you aren't really making art for the 21st century. The plagiarism and copyright trials of the 21st century are what the obscenity trials were to the 20th century. And these are really the issues of our time. Now, of course, we have no more obscenity to get through. Everything is done, but we still have problems with plagiarism. And so to me, these are reproducibility, replication, mirroring, reproduction, copyright, intellectual property are really the true content of writing in the 21st century, at least in the early 21st century. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Dan Raviv. About a half hour after word that pop star Michael Jackson suffered a heart attack in Los Angeles, it's now reported, and reliably reported, that he has died. Los Angeles Times website says Michael Jackson, age 50, has died. He was in a coma when taken from an expensive rental home in Los Angeles. The TMZ website has also been reporting that Michael Jackson has died. We go live now to Los Angeles. CBS News correspondent Steve Futterman. Well, Dan, if this is all correct, it's just a shock here in Southern California and around the world. The LA Times, as you said, saying that Michael Jackson was pronounced dead, according to the LA Times, by doctors this afternoon and arriving at the hospital in a deep coma. I feel that writing from the heart is actually much more uncreative than the kind of ideas I'm proposing. I think creativity has become so uncreative, has become so boring, has become so predictable, what we consider to be creative, that I'm in love with creativity. I just don't like what it's become. So I want to re-infuse it with ideas of plagiarism, insincerity, inauthenticity, all the things that were never allowed to be part of the creative practice, since the creative practice is so shattered, can be thrown back at it with the hopes of reviving it by coming around the other side. You know, so in a weird way, you can break copyright. You can play with the law in a very, very elastic way and really have no repercussions. Again, if I was making a lot of money doing this, they'd come after me. If I had big contracts, I was making millions of dollars, but that's really not the case. So I'm free to break copyright, and nobody seems to care. Copyright, as far as I'm concerned, copyright doesn't exist.
And we are still going to have delays to get through a pretty bad rush hour. We've got major delays on 7th and 8th Avenues as you make your way through the Midtown area. 7th Avenue delays.
In 2011, I was invited to the White House to read my poetry and to have a poetry workshop with the First Lady. And I just said the things that I normally say. I talked about plagiarism, I talked about file sharing, I talked about, inauthenticity, I talked about insincerity, and all the things that I just normally talk about. And I looked at the First Lady, and she was completely engaged. So far as she even went to ask questions about the different things. I talked about my book Day, and she said, "But what day was that you did, and why did you do it?" And she was just like, I'm like, wow, I'm talking about illegal stuff here at the White House, and everybody seems to think it's great. But when I began reading traffic reports, the room lit up. And there's a picture of Obama leaning back in his chair like this, with a big smile on his face, when I was reading traffic reports, okay? So the weirdest, most avant-garde, most appropriated text was the one that got the biggest response, because it was in the language that everybody could understand. It was vernacular. So this is radical populism. People say that the work that I do is undecipherable, nobody can understand it, but in fact the radicality of it is, it's democracy, is the fact that everybody can understand it.
Right out of Central Park all the way down to Times Square. Broadway's not impacted. Obviously, 9th and 10th Avenue seeing more traffic as well, but not as bad as headed through the Times Square area. Meanwhile, on the east side, it's a torture test.
Well, you go to the White House to read. You want to dress pretty well, I would think. And then Obama looked at me and he said, "Hey, that's a great suit. I would wear a suit like that." He said, "But my people would never let me." I think that artists move into the spotlight for a minute, but it doesn't really mean that much. We're still only known by a few people. There's still the same coterie of people that cared then are the same coterie of people that cared now. It's a mistake to think that mainstream culture like that actually cares about what you're doing. You're interesting, you might be entertainment for a night, but in no way does that open up the practice to cultural embrace or even cultural change on any significant level. Duchamp at the height of his fame said, "I live the life of a waiter." I think artists live the life of a waiter, honestly, and then it doesn't get much better than that.
Right now, you've also got jam-ups on the Brooklyn Bridge, bumper to Brooklyn, but the lower roadway is wide open. The Brooklyn Bridge is swamped. The FDR Drive's not looking good either, bumper to bumper right off the Manhattan Bridge. Meanwhile, the West Side Tunnel delays begin in the 70s, and they go all the way south down to the Battery Tunnel.
I think a lot of the questions the works ask are, what can literature possibly be in the digital age? In an age where there's just machines are churning out more words than can ever be read. I think one of the great tragedies of poets is that they assume they're being read, and they're not being read. I mean, really, very, very little. And the more difficult the poetry, the less read it is. And I saw this with the language poets. They all assumed everybody was poring over every word of theirs, and they really weren't. But what they were doing was thinking about the way that poetry was being used in new ways by the language poets. And they were thinking about the work much more than they were reading it, And I thought to myself, well, let's just take that and move from that point of view. Let's assume there'll be no readership. So let's give really interesting concepts to think about. And I think it's a much more honest way and a much more realistic take on poetry. I mean, what do people read? People read Facebook posts, and they read them, I believe, very carefully. They read a Twitter feed, short forms, things that have information. But poetry and literature at this point, I'd say less so.